Ribeye. The best tasting piece of meat on the entire animal is attached to this steak. It has its own name, its own following, and its own price tag at specialty butchers. On a standard ribeye, most people slice straight through it without really appreciating it. The ribeye comes from ribs 6 through 12 along the upper back of the cow. The name refers to the oval center, the eye. The defining quality is marbling, fat running through the meat that bastes the steak from the inside as it cooks. No sauce needed, no marinade. The fat handles it beautifully. Cook it in a cast iron pan or high heat on the grill, medium rare to medium, and let the fat fully render before you pull it off. That hidden piece that most people don't know about is the ribeye cap. It wraps around the outer edge of the eye as a thick, marbled crescent. Chefs and butchers widely regard it as the single best bite of beef on the animal. Some specialty butchers remove it from the ribeye roll and sell it separately at a premium. Anthony Bourdain named the ribeye his favorite steak. The cap is why. Filet mignon. This is the most expensive steak on the menu at almost every restaurant that carries it. Gordon Ramsay has publicly said it is not the best one. He is not wrong. The filet comes from the tenderloin, a long, narrow muscle that sits just beneath the spine in the loin. Cuts from this section are incredibly tender. That is the entire selling point. Where the ribeye is defined by fat, the filet has almost none. No significant marbling, minimal fat content, a flavor profile that is genuinely mild. That is why it almost always arrives with a sauce, béarnaise, a red wine reduction, or compound butter. And it's why it's often wrapped in bacon before cooking. The bacon is not for flavor. It's compensation for the fat the cut doesn't bring on its own. Mignon is French for small or delicate. A full tenderloin yields a limited number of portions, which contributes to the price. What you are paying for is tenderness, and only tenderness. Ramsay's preference for ribeye over this comes down to one word: flavor. At this price point, that's worth knowing before you order. New York strip. Order this steak in New York and it has one name. Order it in Kansas City and it has another. Same muscle, same cut, same cow. The name changes depending on which side of the country you're in. The strip comes from the short loin, which sits directly next to the tenderloin. When a butcher leaves both muscles attached and slices through the bone, the result is a T-bone or porterhouse. The strip is one half of those cuts. The filet or tenderloin is the other. The New York strip has more marbling than the filet, but less than the ribeye. A fat cap runs along one edge. Stand the steak on that edge in a hot pan for about a minute, and the fat renders nicely into the meat. High heat, minimal seasoning, medium rare to medium is how it's usually best. Kansas City strip is the older name, traced to the stockyards that once made that city the center of American beef. The New York version got its name from Delmonico's, the restaurant that popularized it in the 1800s. Both cities still claim credit. The steak tastes good either way. T-bone. There is a federal measurement that determines whether this steak is legally allowed to use its own name. Miss it by a fraction of an inch, and it becomes a completely different steak with a different name and a different price. The T-bone comes from the short loin, the same section as the New York strip. The T-shaped bone runs through the center and divides two muscles, the strip steak on the larger side and the tenderloin on the smaller side. The T-bone steak is both served together. If the tenderloin portion measures at least 1.25 inches across, the steak is legally classified as a porterhouse. Any smaller than that, and it's sold as a T-bone. Same cut, further back on the loin, bigger tenderloin section, and a significantly higher price. The practical problem with the T-bone is that the strip and the tenderloin cook at different rates. The strip side needs more time to cook through, while the tenderloin overcooks easily. Getting both right simultaneously is genuinely difficult. Waffle House has claimed to be the world's leading server of T-bone steaks, at over 10,000 per day. They have not published their method for managing the temperature differential, but it still tastes pretty good at 2 in the morning. Porterhouse. This steak was named after a type of bar. The bar was named after a type of beer. The steak just happened to be on the menu. The bar is gone, the steak is still everywhere. You just finished watching the T-bone section, so you already know the measurement that separates these two cuts. The tenderloin section on a porterhouse must be at least 1.25 inches across per USDA standards. Because the porterhouse is cut from further back on the short loin, where the tenderloin is at its thickest, the fillet side is substantially larger. A full porterhouse typically runs 1.5 to 2 pounds. It is technically one steak, but eating it alone is a commitment. That's why it's frequently sliced off the bone tableside and served on a shared board, and why it earned the nickname King of Steaks. The origin traces to a porterhouse, a tavern that served porter ale in New York City back in 1814. An old hungry maritime pilot who frequented the establishment loved the cut, and the steak became their house specialty. Sirloin. For over 3 centuries, people have believed that a king loved this cut so much he gave it a royal title. Historians say that almost certainly never happened. The sirloin sits in the sirloin primal, behind the short loin, in front of the round. Top sirloin is the better portion, leaner and more tender than the bottom. Less fat than the ribeye, with moderate marbling and a firm texture. It responds well to high heat on a grill or a cast iron skillet and holds up to marinades and compound butters better than fattier cuts because lower fat content means more to gain from added flavor. Medium rare is how it's typically best prepared. The story goes that King Henry VIII loved this cut so much he knighted it, dubbing it sirloin. Food historians have searched for proof of this fact but haven't found it. The name almost certainly comes from the French word surlonge, meaning above the loin. Someone likely invented the knighting story, and it stuck because it's a better story than French etymology. Top sirloin is one of the most consistently ordered steakhouse cuts in America. The reason is price. It costs significantly less than ribeye or filet while still being thought of as a legitimate steak on any menu. Skirt steak. If you have ever ordered fajitas at a restaurant, there is a very strong chance that this exact cut was on that sizzling cast iron plate. The skirt comes from the short plate region, just below the ribs. It exists in 2 versions, inside skirt and outside skirt. The outside is more tender, more flavorful, and almost entirely reserved for restaurants and commercial buyers before it reaches a retail case. What you find at the grocery store is the inside skirt. It's a long, thin strip, up to 24 inches on a large animal, with a loose, open grain and a high fat content. More fat than any other flat steak on this list, which is exactly why it's the standard fajita cut. Fat carries flavor, and this one has plenty of it. Marinating it, even 30 minutes, makes a real difference. Cook it in a cast iron over high heat, pull it at medium rare, and let it rest. Slice it thin against the grain, or you will spend a significant amount of time chewing. The cast iron sizzle when it hits the table at a restaurant is largely theatrical. The steak is good with or without it. Hanger steak. For most of the 20th century, this cut never made it to the butcher's case. Not because it was bad, in fact, just the opposite. The people doing the cutting decided it was too good to sell and kept it for themselves. Like the skirt steak, the hanger comes from the diaphragm area, suspended between the rib and loin, attached near the last rib. Hanging from the diaphragm is literally how it got the name. There is exactly 1 per animal, yielding roughly 1.5 pounds from an animal that can weigh over 800. The flavor is intensely beefy, deeper than sirloin, more pronounced than strip. The grain is coarse and open, with a tough central membrane running through the center that should be removed before cooking. Marinate it, cook it hot and fast, pull it at medium rare, and slice against the grain. Overcook it, and the texture will let you know immediately. European butchers, particularly in France where it's called anglais, held this cut back from customers for decades. The tradition carried into American butcher shops, where they called it the butcher's secret. In the past 2 decades, it started appearing on restaurant menus at prices that accurately reflect how good it is. Flank steak. London broil is not a cut of beef. It never was, and yet it has been printed on grocery store packaging for over 100 years. The flank comes from the flank region, the lower belly of the cow just below where the skirt sits. Leaner than skirt steak and slightly less flavor. Wide, flat, with a pronounced grain running along its length. A single flank steak is large enough to feed several people, which makes it a practical cut in a way that filet or strip never will be. London broil is a preparation method. Marinate a lean cut, broil it, slice thin across the grain. Flank steak is the cut most commonly used for that preparation. At some point, grocers started labeling the cut after the method, and it spread. The flank is the flank. The preparation is a choice you make, not something printed on the package. Flank steak is the standard cut for carne asada and gets used heavily in Asian stir-fry preparations. It was a budget cut for most of its history, Then the popularity of those two preparations drove demand and the price followed. Marinate it, grill it medium rare to medium, and slice it against the grain before it goes on the plate. Flat iron. This steak did not exist until 2002. The meat was always there. Two university researchers got a grant to figure out why no one could use it, and accidentally invented one of the most popular restaurant steaks of the last 2 decades. The flat iron comes from the shoulder blade, the top blade muscle in the chuck primal. The name comes from the shape, a rectangular slab that resembles an old-fashioned metal flat iron. The resemblance is accurate enough that the name required no explanation when it launched. For most of modern butchering history, this cut was useless as a steak. A thick band of connective tissue ran directly through the center, making it impossible to cook as a single piece. The standard outcome was the meat grinder, same destination as the tri-tip and chuck eye that comes next in this list. But in 2002, researchers at the University of Nebraska and the University of Florida received a grant to study underutilized beef muscles. They identified how to remove the connective tissue entirely, leaving 2 clean pieces that could each be sold as a steak. The result turned out to be the second most tender cut on the animal after the tenderloin, more marbling than most flat steaks. Grill it or sear it, medium rare, with or without marinade. Tri-tip. For most of American history, this cut was not a steak. Outside of one stretch of California's Central Coast, the entire country was grinding it into hamburger. The tri-tip comes from the bottom sirloin, a triangular muscle at the very base of the sirloin section. It's also sold as the triangle steak, Santa Maria steak, or California cut. Through most of the 20th century, butchers on the East Coast and in the Midwest had no retail market for it as a standalone steak, so it went to the grinder. Same outcome the flat iron saw before 2002. What kept it alive was a single regional tradition. Santa Maria-style barbecue, centered in California's Central Valley, built its identity around this cut. Simple dry rub, red oak fire, a cooking approach that sits between low and slow and direct grilling. That tradition spread to the rest of California through the 1990s and reached the rest of the country shortly after. The unusual detail is the grain. 2 grain directions meet at a seam running through the middle of the cut. Slice it as one piece and half of it ends up noticeably tougher than the other. The correct approach is to cut it in 2 at the seam, then slice each half separately against its own grain. Best served medium rare to medium, rested before cutting. Chuck eye. There is a steak that comes from the exact same muscle as a ribeye, costs 30 to 40% less, and your grocery store almost certainly has right now. It is almost certainly not on display. The ribeye runs along ribs 6 through 12 as previously mentioned. The chuck eye picks up at the 5th rib, 1 rib closer to the shoulder. There are only 2 chuck eyes per animal. Because most operations process chuck for braising or grinding rather than cutting steaks, these cuts rarely make it to the display case. Ask a butcher directly, and they can usually produce one fresh. The shoulder muscles work harder than the rib muscles, which makes the texture slightly firmer and the fat distribution a bit different. The flavor profile is close enough that the cut's nickname has survived for decades, the poor man's ribeye. At a third less cost, the comparison is genuinely hard to argue with. Bavette Steak. Paris bistros have been serving this steak the exact same way. Shallots, butter, red wine, for over 200 years. It has never really needed anything else. Bavette comes from the bottom sirloin, adjacent to the flank region you heard about a few sections back. Bavette is French for bib. In the US, the same cut is sold as sirloin flap or flap steak, neither of which is a name that inspires confidence at a butcher counter. That naming might be a large part of the reason why this cut hasn't built the same following here that it has in France. The grain is similar to skirt steak, which means marinades absorb faster and more completely than they do in cuts with tighter fibers. The fat content is higher than flank, the flavor more intense. It takes heat well and falls apart beautifully when sliced correctly. Bavette à l'échalote, bavette with shallots, is a fixture at serious Paris bistros. Hot pan, medium rare, thin slices against the grain, shallot butter is how it's perfectly done. American restaurants have started featuring it, primarily at spots that focus on high-quality ingredients and specialize in lesser-known cuts. Round steak. Arby's roast beef almost always comes from this cut. Take that however you want. The round comes from the rear leg, the round primal, which includes top round, bottom round, and eye of round. All 3 are heavily worked muscles. The rear leg drives the animal forward constantly, which means continuous use, dense muscle fibers, and almost no fat or marbling. What you get is lean, firm, and among the most affordable beef in any grocery store. top round is the standard cut for deli counters and fast food chains, thin-sliced and processed enough that the toughness becomes manageable. As a standalone pan-seared steak, it does not perform well. The lean muscle has no internal fat to carry it through dry heat, and anything past a slow braise tends to produce a result that no seasoning fully rescues. If you want to cook it as a steak rather than a roast, marinate it heavily and slice it paper-thin against the grain. The other option is braising. Low heat, liquid, several hours, which is what the cut is actually built for. Picanha. Outside the United States, many serious meat cultures consider this the best steak there is. Inside the United States, it's mostly encountered at a Brazilian steakhouse. Picanha comes from the top of the rump, also called the sirloin cap or rump cap depending on the market. In American grocery stores, it sometimes appears as culotte, and the thick fat cap is frequently removed before sale. That is the wrong approach. The fat cap is the reason this steak exists as its own category. At a churrascaria, also known as a Brazilian steakhouse, picanha is folded into a C shape, skewered on a long metal spit, and rotated over charcoal. As the outside cooks, slices are carved off tableside and the spit goes back over the fire. The fat cap renders as the meat turns, basting it from above without any additional effort. Brazil treats this as its national steak. The rest of South America largely agrees. In the US, recognition has grown through social media and expanding interest in Brazilian churrasco, the grilling tradition that gave the churrascaria its identity. Tomahawk. This steak can cost $150 at a restaurant. The meat is not the reason you order it. The tomahawk is a bone-in ribeye, the same cut from the beginning of this video, from the same ribs, with the same marbling and fat. The difference is that the entire rib bone is left intact and Frenched, scraped clean down to the meat, leaving a handle between 6 and 8 inches long. The finished cut resembles a Native American tomahawk axe. The bone adds almost nothing to the flavor during a typical high-heat cook. What it contributes is spectacle. The tomahawk became a restaurant signature around 2015 to 2018, driven almost entirely by food photography and social media. A standard bone-in ribeye of equivalent quality runs significantly less. The price difference is literally just because of the part you don't eat. 2 pounds of bone-in ribeye on a foot-long Frenched handle looks exactly like something Fred Flintstone would order, and that comparison gets made so often it's practically part of the marketing. The Flintstones first aired in 1960. 50 years later, the food became something you could actually order off a menu. It's usually cooked on low oven heat first, then finished with a hot sear. Plan to share it with at least 2 people. 3 is more realistic. That covers every major steak cut you're likely to see on a menu. Now all you need is the right starch to go with it. Be sure to check out our next video, Every Type of French Fry.